It should come as no surprise that Thoreau was heavily influenced by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and most students and most people, if they know Thoreau, they know him because of this book he wrote called Walden. And Walden, in many ways, was the result of a political project to separate. Thoreau wanted to separate himself from society and the responsibilities of society. And this is something of an oversimplification, but in doing so, he wanted to see, or he wanted to interrogate a question, which was, to what degree could he live a simple, perhaps today we would use language like minimalistic, but a self-sufficient or self-reliant life. And he did that for, I believe, the better part of 2 years on, if I recall correctly, Emerson's property in Massachusetts. But in this essay, Resistance to Civil Government, again, heavily influenced by Emerson, some of those transcendental and transcendentalist themes and ideas are quite present, but I do want to say something as a way of expanding our understanding of what transcendentalism is. But all of that aside, I thoroughly enjoy this essay, and I hope you do as well. There's something a bit virtuosic about it, which is to say, it is an essay with a single or a central thesis, which we will discuss. Maybe if we wanted to articulate what that thesis is, it's better to think of it as more of a question. How does one resist a civil government? How does one disobey in a civil and mannered way? But it's also an essay that tries to grapple with a myriad of different ideas and topics, from everything including the need for, again, individualism or self-reliance, the importance of nonconformity, the trouble or problems with laws and governments or the state. But it's also an essay that grapples with the potential problems inherent in voting, and maybe if we wanted to be more specific, the inherent problems with thinking oneself engaged if all one does is vote. It's also an essay that grapples with the prison system, and perhaps today what we would call the prison industrial complex, and how we as a society and a culture think and treat the prisoner. It's an essay about race. It should come as no surprise, if you paid attention, that Thoreau was an abolitionist. He wrote and writes quite persuasively about the problems with slavery as an institution. This is in many ways an anti-war essay. It's an essay that antagonizes the notion of taxes and taxation for reasons that we'll discuss, because I think if you're someone, for example, who likes the TV show Parks and Recreation, you might think of a figure like Ron Swanson, who speaks in the show quite passionately about taxation as theft, and one almost has the impression that for a character like Ron Swanson, he's borrowing quite heavily from Thoreau. But I think for someone like Thoreau, there's more nuance to this idea. It's not just that taxation is theft. More than anything, it's, well, what are our taxes? What does the government use our taxes for? What am I supporting by perhaps not, again, behaving in a way that is consistent with my conscience? And because of that, again, there is something about this essay that still resonates today. It should come as no surprise, for example, that a figure like Martin Luther King Jr. found Thoreau's ideas of civil disobedience quite persuasive, because that in many ways informed his understanding of how to behave and how to agitate and antagonize for civil rights for African Americans. And even, again, within this very particular moment that we find ourselves, I will certainly try to say something about potential challenges to Thoreau, because I think now more than ever, we might read someone like Thoreau and find his ideas interesting and persuasive, but ultimately left asking ourselves, well, to what degree is some of those transcendental ideas, in particular about self-reliance, the importance of nonconformity, to what degree do those sorts of ideas actually work in a moment like this, where we are attempting to survive a global pandemic? So those are certainly questions that I'll encourage you to think about near the end of today's audio lecture. But like I did with Emerson, I think I will just identify or discuss some of Thoreau's main points, which I've already mentioned, but I'll reference particular moments from the text as a way of grounding some of those points and ideas. But before I do that, I said a moment ago that I wanted to potentially expand our understanding of transcendentalism. And just to remind you, some of the things I said in the Emerson lecture about transcendentalism, it's a philosophy that prioritized radical individualism, or again, because maybe for someone like Emerson, when he wrote Self-Reliance, he didn't have that kind of a word, so instead he would use a phrase like self-reliance. It's certainly anti-institution, and there's an inherent appreciation of nature for reasons that I discussed in the last lecture. But I think what Thoreau shows us is how intellectually omnivorous some of these transcendentalist writers were. And what I mean by that is these are not writers, figures like Thoreau and Emerson, who, when they were influenced by particular writers and thinkers, they were not influenced exclusively by Western writers and Western thinkers. And even if you think back to some of the things that Emerson wrote about religion and Christianity, you might perhaps arrive at this conclusion that perhaps transcendentalism didn't have a place intellectually and philosophically for religious texts like the Bible. But I think what you see in Thoreau, maybe more so than in the Emerson essay I asked you to read, is how for a transcendentalist thinker like Thoreau, they're just borrowing from anyone and everyone. They do not discriminate. All they really seem to want are interesting and thought-provoking ideas. Therefore, for a figure like Thoreau, he quotes and cites important secular figures like William Shakespeare, but he also quotes and cites from the Bible. He quotes and cites Western philosophers and Eastern philosophers. So again, there's something omnivorous about these transcendentalist thinkers. If they discriminate at all, it's on the grounds of good ideas and bad ideas. They just want good ideas more than anything else. And creed, country, culture, those sorts of considerations that some might have when they think to themselves, who are these influential figures from the past that inform my thinking? A transcendentalist like Thoreau doesn't seem to discriminate on those grounds. He just wants a good idea if and when he can find it. So I wanted to at least say that because I, again, think it helps to explain why he might quote from different and particular sources, maybe in ways that Emerson doesn't, at least not in Self-Reliance. You could find different essays that Emerson wrote where maybe he quotes as aggressively as Thoreau does here in Resistance to Civil Government. But maybe the best place to start is, again, where he borrows quite explicitly from someone like Emerson, and that is with the individual and the importance of the individual, the importance of self-reliance, and the importance of nonconformity. So near the beginning of the essay on 954, this is what Thoreau writes. And he's asking a series of questions here. Can there not be a government in which majorities do not virtually decide right and wrong, but conscious, in which majorities decide only those questions to which the rule of expediency is applicable? Must the citizen ever, for a moment, or in the last decree, resign his conscience to the legislator? Why has every man a conscience, then? I think that we should be men first and subjects afterward. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. So I'll pause here because, again, you can see that, like Emerson, he is prioritizing the individual over the communal, which places him in direct and stark contrast to a figure like Winthrop, who would say first order priority is the community, second order priority is the individual. But again, for these transcendentalists, they want to flip it. But also notice what he says here at the end of the passage that I read. So much as for the right, and that's in relation to the law. And this is something that Thoreau develops throughout this essay. When confronted by the law, it is not enough for the individual to simply acquiesce to the law. And perhaps one might go as far as to say it's not enough for the individual to antagonize the law because, you know, it's fun to antagonize authority. Being rebellious is entertaining. But the question Thoreau seems to want his reader to consider as well, what is right, and how do we understand those ideas, and how do we understand those terms? Now, on 956, Thoreau continues to make reference to the importance of the individual. And this is what he writes on 956. There are thousands who are in opinion opposed to slavery. And he's speaking specifically about slavery and war here. And this is important. There are thousands who are in opinion opposed to slavery and to the war, who yet in effect do nothing to put an end to them, who, esteeming themselves children of Washington and Franklin, sit down with their hands in their pockets and say that they know not what to do, and do nothing, who even postpone the question of freedom to the question of free trade, and quietly read the prices current along with the latest advices from Mexico after dinner, and it may be fall asleep over them both. What is the price current of an honest man and patriot today? They hesitate and they regret and sometimes they petition, but they do nothing in earnest and with effect. They will wait well disposed for others to remedy the evil, that they may no longer have it to regret. At most, they give only a cheap vote, a feeble countenance, and Godspeed to the right as it goes by them. So here, Thoreau foregrounds this question of self-reliance or the importance of the individual in, for him, contemporary political issues, which is to say slavery and war. And his point here seems to be that certain individuals will see and understand a problem in society, but they have neither the will nor the desire to do anything about it. And regrettably, when they might have the will or desire to do something about those potential problems, it's always too late. So again, you can see Thoreau borrowing quite heavily from Emerson. And if you recall back to one of the points of discussion regarding Emerson's self-reliance, he argued that it's far better to have someone accuse you of hypocrisy, which is to say it's far better to seem inconsistent from one day to the next than to not speak for a lack of a better phrase, your truth. Maybe we would use a contemporary construction like that. But for someone like Thoreau, again, like Emerson, this is so important. This fidelity to who you are and what you are at every conceivable moment. Now, I'll talk about one of these potential problems or critiques of this idea later because, today we are inundated by information, and you often hear people and different perspectives on what in previous generations would be facts or pieces of information that are unambiguously the truth. And you might hear people today say things like, well, those are your facts and these are my facts about the same idea. And that is certainly a critique, I suppose, one could make of Thoreau, that perhaps he's encouraging his reader to think that, well, if your truth is a particular interpretation on a set of facts, then that's fine. That's your truth. But again, I think for someone like Thoreau, there's far more to it than just that. This is not about, and I don't think this is ultimately what he's arguing, that you should just say whatever is maybe politically advantageous for you and politically advantageous for whatever your ideological assumptions are or whatever party you might affiliate with. There's a degree of interrogation that's important for a figure like Thoreau, which helps to inform what all of this ultimately means. This again, as Emerson suggested, this willingness or this acceptance of an accusation of hypocrisy if it means you're speaking what you mean and what you feel and what you believe. But I think for a transcendentalist thinker, how you arrive at what you think and what you believe and what you feel matters a lot. But you could also imagine that the passage that I just read is meant to read like a call to action in some ways. That, again, for someone like Thoreau and even Emerson, the way institutions, the way society, the way the state lulls citizens into a position of complacency, that for someone like Thoreau is deeply problematic. And again, for someone like Thoreau, it is far better to speak whatever you think your truth might be from one particular day to the next than to realize at some point in the future that what was your truth in the past has now become perhaps conventional wisdom, or you've just simply missed your opportunity to act. Again, it seems like for figures like Thoreau and Emerson, missing that opportunity is one of the worst things that can happen to you. And I thought I would cite just a few additional passages, 959, and I think this is where Thoreau offers us a sense of what civil disobedience looks like and what it ultimately means to resist. And this is what he writes on 959. If the injustice is part of the necessary friction of the machine of government, let it go. Let it go. Perchance it will wear smooth. Certainly the machine will wear out. If the injustice has a spring or a pulley or a rope or a crank exclusively for itself, then perhaps you may consider whether the remedy will not be worse than the evil. But if it is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then, I say, break the law. Let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. What I have to do is to see, at any rate, that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn. Now, here, again, I think what Thoreau is ultimately suggesting is if you want to be principled, you must be willing to make a particular sort of sacrifice. And this is why, for example, and I'll talk about this a bit later, this is why he seems to have such problems with voting, because he seems to think that voting is to some degree ineffectual, because it's leaving your or risking that your voice will be subject to chance in some way, that perhaps there's something not forceful enough about voting, that he seems to prize and prioritize something that's quite forceful. And here perhaps we're getting a sense of the ethical dimensions of what it means to resist a civil government, and it's the willingness that perhaps we as individuals should have as it relates to the law, the machinery that is society. It's this willingness that we should all have to perhaps forfeit or sacrifice our lives for our principles. Notice again, I'll read Thoreau directly. What I have to do is to see at any rate that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn. And if we think about what that ultimately means, well, in some situations, we feel an immense amount of pressure to acquiesce to whatever the state or whatever a set of laws ascribe for us and tell us we must do. But for someone like Thoreau, he seems to think if the institution itself, if the machine itself, if the laws themselves are unjust enough, you cannot just vote for reform. You must be willing to take this radical, perhaps even self-destructive step. Again, notice he says, let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. So there is something here, and I think the question I would encourage you to consider is, well, how far is Thoreau encouraging us to take this? Now, later in the essay, he writes about how in the face of a tax collector, he just refuses at times to pay taxes. And because of that, he was placed in prison. So is that the limit, or is he even suggesting that one should be prepared to sacrifice one's life on the basis of a principle? I would just ask you to consider what are the, and maybe this is even a bad question to ask, or it's a question that I'm asking in bad faith, because maybe Thoreau's point is there can be no limit whatsoever to act ethically, to be self-reliant, to behave in a way that's consistent with your principles. You cannot negotiate, you cannot acquiesce, but that's a question I'll leave to all of you to think about. Is there a limit here? And if so, what is that limit, perhaps? But maybe the final thing I'll quote is on 960, because I think for Thoreau, for Emerson, for these transcendentalists, the individual has power, and I think that's important to them. And this is what Thoreau writes. I know this well, that if 1,000, if 100, if 10 men whom I could name, if 10 honest men only, if one honest man in this state of Massachusetts, ceasing to hold slaves, were actually to withdraw from this co-partnership and be locked up in the county jail, therefore, it would be the abolition of slavery in America. For it matters not how small the beginning may seem to be, what is once well done is done forever. And here, this is both extremely rousing and persuasive, but perhaps you could accuse Thoreau of being a bit naive. And I think this is one of the, maybe I'll talk about this now, this is one of the critiques that people often make of Thoreau, and perhaps by extension Emerson, that this transcendentalist principle. And I think, again, it's encapsulated here, the power of single individuals. Maybe there's something a bit naive about it, because pay attention to what Thoreau just said, that if one slave-holding man in Massachusetts just opted out and even went to prison on principle, the institution of slavery would end. Well, if you know anything about slavery in the American South, I think you know that just one person standing on principle, one white slave owner standing and acting on principle, regrettably wasn't enough. And again, while Thoreau's making a larger rhetorical point, and maybe even you could argue that what he's ultimately suggesting is, sure, maybe one individual doesn't have the power to do this, but think about what would happen if every single person thought of themselves as equally equipped to effect change as a single individual. What might happen, but just unto itself as it reads on the page, it sounds a bit naive. So while this kind of rousing bit of rhetoric is quite marvelous to read, it's just so beautifully phrased, and the idea itself is so aspirational. And you could even argue that there's something foundational about this idea to many of our conceptions of what it means to be an American. It's also perhaps a bit naive. But from here, I think I would like to quote a couple of passages where he, and I've already gestured to some of this, the trouble or the problems he has with laws, governments, institutions. He called it the machine in a passage I quoted earlier. And I think I'll just go to 954, because I think here there's a perfect encapsulation of Thoreau's thoughts about laws, the law, society at large, governments, and how all of those intersect. This is around the middle of the page. A common and natural result of an undue respect for law is that you may see a file of soldiers, colonel, captain, corporal, privates, powder monkeys and all, marching in admirable order over hill and dale to the wars against their wills, against their common sense and consciences, which makes it very steep marching indeed, and produces a palpitation of the heart. They have no doubt that it is a damnable business in which they are concerned. They are all peaceably inclined. Now, what are they? Men at all? Or small movable forts and magazines at the service of some unscrupulous man in power? Visit the Navy Yard and behold a Marine, such a man as an American government can make, or such as it can make a man with its black arts, a mere shadow and reminiscence of humanity, a man laid out alive and standing and already, as one may say, buried under arms with funeral accompaniments. So here, and I think it's also worth noting, for someone like Thoreau, this is not just a essay where he antagonizes the government for what, by creating these laws, what it causes mankind to be and become. He's also, in many ways, offering a critique of capitalism, or this ideological and economic system that was beginning to flourish in the mid-19th century. On 956, for example, he writes, "Practically speaking, the opponents to a reform in Massachusetts are not 100,000 politicians at the South, but 100,000 merchants and farmers here who are more interested in commerce and agriculture than they are in humanity." So again, it's fascinating to me how, for someone like Thoreau, he's offering these critiques of not only government, not only the law, but he's offering critiques of capitalism and capitalist accumulation and the way capital often just utterly dehumanizes all of us in the pursuit of profit. And he was doing this in the mid-19th century. He was doing this concurrently with a figure like Karl Marx, who, say what you will about Marx, think what you will about Marx, I wouldn't begrudge you for it, but he offers a rather persuasive critique of capital just as an institution. Now, from here, I think I've already talked about some of his feelings regarding voting, but I did want to at least quote one or two passages. This is 956 and 957. All voting is a sort of gaming, like checkers or backgammon, with a slight moral tinge to it, a playing with right and wrong with moral questions, and betting naturally accompanies it. The character of the voters is not staked. I cast my vote perchance as I think right, but I am not vitally concerned that that right should prevail. I am willing to leave it to the majority. Its obligation, therefore, never exceeds that of expediency. Even voting for the right is doing nothing for it. It is only expressing to men feebly your desire that it should prevail. A wise man will not leave the right to the mercy of chance, nor wish it to prevail through the power of the majority. Now, again, like Emerson, I mentioned last time that one of the problems, regrettably, with a figure like Emerson is that he is so endlessly quotable that he's often misquoted or quoted, but without the proper context. And I think here you could make a similar, maybe not critique, but you could say a similar thing about Thoreau, because pay attention to what Thoreau is ultimately suggesting. He's suggesting that voting is not that effective. And you could imagine how someone could just pluck this quote out of this essay and come to the conclusion that voting is dumb and I should never vote. Two things. First, that's not what Thoreau's suggesting. But second, that's completely missing what he says later in the essay, and I've already talked about it. That completely misses or disavows what he says later in the essay about how to actually affect change, perhaps, if we wanted to use that kind of language, to actually behave in a way that is consistent with your principles, you need to go much farther than voting will ever permit and allow you. But if you just read this, and if you just read this passage unto itself, it's hard to get to that idea. So again, what Thoreau's suggesting, I don't necessarily know if it's that problematic or even that provocative, but just taken unto itself, you could see how someone could almost use a quote like this as an excuse for saying voting is nonsense, nothing matters, and that's certainly not what Thoreau's suggesting, but that's often something that people who misquote and misappropriate these transcendentalist thinkers often think. Again, there is something quite dangerous about being endlessly quotable. Now, I think it's also worth considering what Thoreau says about, again, what we would perhaps today call the prison industrial complex, or just prisons at large, and also what he says about how people treat prisoners. And there are two passages that I want to bring to your attention, and here, Thoreau does use a rather antiquated phrase like Indian, but I'll go ahead and just read the text as it exists on the page. It is there that the fugitive slave and the Mexican prisoner on parole and the Indian come to plead the wrongs of his race should find them on that separate but more free and honorable ground where the state places those who are not with her but against her. The only house is a slave state in which a free man can abide with honor. If any think that their influence would be lost there and their voices no longer afflict the ear of the state, that they would not be as an enemy within its walls, they do not know but how much truth is stronger than error, not how much more eloquently and effectively he can combat injustice who has experienced a little in his own person. Cast your whole vote, not a strip of paper merely, but your whole influence. And I think, again, my goodness, for someone like Thoreau, he's crystallizing. Sure, if you go about as far as someone could, where you suffer imprisonment for your principles, pay attention to what Thoreau suggests, what you ultimately gain by doing that. You gain a perspective that is important, that will help you, in theory, affect change later. And it might also, again, allow you to see and perceive certain differences between you and, for lack of a better phrase, the dominant order, and seeing those differences matters. Because again, for someone like Thoreau, for someone like Emerson, the problem is what society ultimately does to people, how it has this homogenizing effect. And I think for someone like Thoreau, this becomes quite clear when one is eventually freed from prison. And I won't read directly, this is on 964, but Thoreau's point seems to be that after leaving prison, he immediately perceived this difference or this separation between him and those individuals who occupy this town. And I think the point that Thoreau seems to make, again, and this complements something I mentioned just a moment ago, having a set of principles and reacting to and behaving in accordance to those principles in a way that seems radical and extreme, it has an effect. It's almost as if it can protect you against society or the state or the law's attempts to assimilate you in some ways. It's as if Thoreau suggests there's no way he could ever turn back from this moment. Something has changed, something has shifted, and for him, that change and that shift, of course it's important, but how he arrives at that place is equally important. Now, I said a moment ago, or to be more accurate, I said at the beginning of this lecture that I wanted to say a few things about maybe potential challenges we could offer to what Thoreau ultimately suggests in this essay. And I mentioned one of them. Perhaps there's something a bit naive or even something a bit fantastical about these ideas, but I think another way of offering a critique is to well, ask, to what degree is it plausible to live by the principles that Thoreau espouses? Now, I mentioned that figures like Martin Luther King Jr. were heavily influenced by Thoreau, not exclusively by Thoreau, of course, but even someone like Emerson later wrote that while the ideas and principles of transcendentalism matter to him, he questioned whether or not someone could actually live a transcendentalist life, or if someone could actually live by the principles espoused in these sorts of transcendentalist texts. So I think that's maybe another critique one could make. To what degree, and I think it's connected to what I said earlier about how all of this, while it might sound great, and while it does, I think to many sound great, it's worth asking to what degree is this even plausible. But I think maybe you could also accuse, and we talked about this a bit with Emerson, you could also accuse someone like Thoreau of indulging in a kind of solipsism, which is to say an overemphasis or an overinvestment in the individual. And I think for all of us, reading and studying an essay like this while in our homes, socially isolated because of a global pandemic, we're reassessing the degree to which we imagine ourselves as individuals as possessing a unique and unimpeachable set of powers and authorities, because I think what this pandemic is teaching us, or what it perhaps has already taught us, is that the will of the individual and the power and the authority of the individual has distinct and noticeable limits. And at some point, we must do more than just simply think of ourselves as individuals. And so maybe that's another way of thinking of a critique of this text, that, and maybe even a critique of transcendentalism at large, that it's a bit too solipsistic. It prioritizes the individual to a degree that it's actually destructive. But I'll leave it to you to decide what you ultimately think of that. But I'm at the 40-minute mark, and I think this is a good place to stop. There's so much more I could say about this essay, and probably so much more if we were in a traditional classroom that a lot of you could say. Okay, thank you so much. Have a good day, and I'll talk to you soon.